A very good morning to all and welcome to NParks Spotlight. My name is Leslie and I'm from the National Biodiversity Centre at the National Parks Board. Thank you all for taking the time to join us on Zoom and YouTube today. And a warm welcome back to anyone who's been with us over the past 9 weeks. Since June, we've explored many facets of our city in nature. We've looked at nocturnal mammals, birds, sea turtles, spiders, freshwater fish, and some very rare crabs that are endemic to Singapore. We've also learned about different habitats, from our rainforests to our coasts. And there is still so much more to see on our little red dot. Do continue to tune in every Saturday morning from 10:30 to 11:30 on Zoom or on the NParksSG YouTube channel. Today, we will be venturing into deeper waters. My colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Low, will guide us through our marine seascape to discover the variety of fish that live in waters around our island. As always, here is the program for today. I'd like to point out that for those on Zoom, if you have any questions during the talk, please send them to me, Leslie, as a private message using the Zoom chat. And we will try to get our speaker to answer a few of them after his talk. So let's dive right in. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Low, Senior Manager of the Coastal and Marine Branch at the National Biodiversity Centre, to regale us with his fishy tales. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Leslie. And good morning to everyone. Thank you all for coming to attend this talk on a lovely Saturday morning. Let me just share my screen on the presentation. Just to recap, I'm Jeffrey Low. I'm a Senior Manager at the National Biodiversity Centre of the National Parks Board. I would like to point out that most of the photographs you'll see in this presentation were taken by me and in Singapore unless otherwise stated. I've tried to keep the non-Singapore photos to a minimum, just to show that Singapore has a very good marine biodiversity. So let me just dive right in. Now, many people in Singapore have this perception that diving in Singapore is dark, you can't see anything. One of the main questions I get is, you dive in Singapore, can see anything, man? Right? Because most people are used to diving in more pristine, clear waters like in Malaysia or further afield like Thailand, Maldives and so on. Those are great holiday destinations for diving. But I hope that through this talk, I can dispel some of those myths. Perhaps I'll start this talk by sharing with you how I began on this journey working on fish. Like most people, when I first started out, to me, a fish was something on the table, cooked, stewed, fried, sauteed, whatever. Either that or it's whatever people call a fish, jellyfish, for example, starfish, cuttlefish. These were all fish to me when I first started. Then as I started to learn more about fish, realized that actually there were a lot of different kinds of fish in all shapes, sizes, and colors. Unfortunately, even with this advanced knowledge, it was just, oh, this is a fish, oh, that's a fish, and so on. Learning more as I went through my years at NUS, having a very bubbly fish mentor in the shape of Grace Lane, I then started to learn more how to differentiate the fish itself, butterfly fish, sweetlets, angelfish, snappers, and so on. When I get to the master level, where I can sort of recite, names of fishes just at the top of my head, I will let you know. Maybe we can have another session there. Now, you might ask why fish is important, and I think most of us in our gut know this, even if we don't think about it. Singaporeans eat about 22 kilograms of fish per year, and we see fish on our tables in various forms, right? As fresh catch in the market, as sushi, or as I already mentioned, as a steam plate on our dinner table. So the seafood industry is estimated to be about $1 billion US, at least in 2016. I suspect it's even higher now. So fish are important to our daily lives, right? And I can't talk about fish in this presentation without the current buzz that's going on the internet and in the newspapers. Just a couple of days ago, somebody on a boat saw a whale shark somewhere in Singapore waters. And in the back of my mind, I was, oh yes, I have to use this for my presentation today. Our first published sighting of a whale shark was in June of 1964, which I must say was a very good month and a very good year. So unfortunately, the first sighting of the shark was when it was encountered off Pulau Sebarok, I believe. And not knowing that it was a gentle giant, they actually shot and killed the shark. Things have progressed since then. We do know that whale sharks now are gentle, they're not ferocious man-eaters. In fact, most sharks aren't ferocious man-eaters. But the whale shark in particular feeds off plankton, which it filters off out of the water. So it's really harmless to humans. And I'm glad that in this instance, a few days ago, that the shark swam by, people got excited, took photos, and then let it on its way. Part of the work I do also revolves around the Sisters Islands Marine Park. And in late 2018, in conjunction with a collaborative project with JTC, they set up a artificial reef, which you can see here in this screenshot from the CNA website. This sort of A-frame structure, there were about 8 of them lowered into the water, is expected to provide refuge or additional grounds for corals to recruit and for fish to colonize. And let me just share with you a couple of stories from the work I've done in this particular area. Now, one of the dives that we did, it was a slightly murky day, and 2 researchers went into the water, and quite unexpectedly, this like 5 to 6 foot long giant barracuda came up behind them, looked over their shoulder, and I was like, what are these guys doing here? And then shadowed them throughout the dive through the artificial reef until they completed the dive, and then the barracuda swam away into the distance. You can imagine the shock to see a 5 foot long barracuda with very sharp teeth just over your shoulder. They were quite scared and excited at the same time. And the reason why this photo is so dark is because they were worried that the flash or the torchlights that they use to illuminate the fish might startle the barracuda and cause it to go into defensive mode. So the photos that they took, of which this is the best one, were all without lights. Now the artificial reef itself, it's like a condominium for fish, or maybe a school. It's colonized by fish very rapidly, and this was just about a year into the actual placement itself, where you can see loads of fish at the bottom. And also at the top. Now, most of these fish use the artificial reef as refuge, but some, in this case here, the rabbit fish, as you can see, are also feeding off the fouling or the bioorganisms that have fouled the structure itself. Now, this then makes it like not only a condominium for fish to stay in, but also has its own canteen or food court, which is great because the fish hang around there and don't want to leave. Oops. Okay. Some other tales which I can share with you. This is a pipefish called the Jan's pipefish. It's very pretty, it's very small. It's got this orange body with a blue head and a blue tail. We first encountered this off an island called Pulau Jong under a rock shelf, and we were like, oh, such a pretty pipefish. I wonder if we'll see it anywhere else. And true enough, with a little bit of hunting, we managed to find it again at Pulau Hantu, again at Sisters, and also at Raffles. And as you can see from the right, where's the mouse? The right picture here, they've actually started to breed because these are the juveniles. So potentially this fish has now taken a foothold in Singapore waters and will be able to encounter it more regularly. Some other very shy fishes are these duck fishes. Now I'm showing here two different species. This is the lira-tailed duckfish, and this is, I don't know what the common name of this fish is, but it's Pteroelotris microlepis. These fish are particularly shy and takes a lot of patience and very careful breathing underwater not to scare them. Now, the reason they're called duck fishes is that even though most of the time they're hanging in the water column, when they are startled, they will duck and hide very quickly into a goby hole. So hence the name duck fishes. There is one other species which I don't have a photo of that has been reported off Singapore waters, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that one day I'll be able to see this fish and get a photo of it. Other small and very hard to see fishes. Now, sea urchins aren't exactly the animal that you would want to visit or examine closely if you're on the reef, because their spines are really sharp and they can sometimes even penetrate thin wetsuits. So many divers stay away from these guys. But from my experience diving overseas, I know that sea urchins can also be home to a lot of marine creatures, in particular this particular fish. The sea urchin clingfish uses the sea urchin as a protective home, right? So the spines keep away the predators while this tiny fish happily swims around in between the spines. And to find it in Singapore, I think was one of the highlights of my dives, because I never expected to find this here. We come next to the fish that I think many of us know or have heard about. They basically win the daddy awards of parenting in the marine realm, because seahorses and pipefishes, for example, the males are the ones that actually look after the eggs and sort of give birth to the juveniles. I don't have a photo of a seahorse with the pouch, but basically the male develops a pouch around the stomach area that carries the eggs, and then the juveniles are ejected from that pouch when they hatch. Similarly, pipefishes also have this pouch. Most of them have this pouch. There is one species, however, which is here on the left, on the right. They call it crocodile pipefish. It doesn't develop a pouch, but it sort of holds the eggs within skin folds on its belly, as you can see here in this photo. Then the juveniles then just hatch directly out of the eggs into the water. Very cool. Seahorses and pipefishes aren't the only daddies that look after eggs. Cardinal fishes as well do this. The difference is they don't develop a pouch or anything. What they will do is that the parent will hold the eggs within its mouth until the eggs hatch, which is quite a mouthful. Yeah. As you can see from this photo here on the top left, the mouth is slightly distended because it's got a bunch of eggs inside the mouth. And we have a lot of different cardinal fishes, from tiny ones. This one is maybe about 3 centimeters long, to very large ones. This one is a wolf cardinal. It's about maybe 10 to 15 centimeters long, and very colorful ones as well. This is what they call a pajama cardinal, and it's got like bright red eyes with yellow and black and white coloration. Very beautiful fish. Then we can also share some very strange habits of fish in general. This group of fish, the anemone fish, are unusual in several aspects. One is that they actually live within the tentacles of stinging anemones. Now, anemones typically feed on plankton, small fish, and they have stinging tentacles with which they paralyze their prey. For some reason, the anemone fish are immune to these stings, and they live within the anemone, thus getting protection from the anemone. One other interesting habit from these guys is that the largest individual, for example, this one here on the left, top left slide, is typically the female. All the other smaller ones, such as these, for example, are males. And apparently the female suppresses the development of the males, keeping them small and male through hormonal interactions. If the female dies, the next largest male then changes sex, becomes the female, and then becomes the dominant female within that colony. We have several species in Singapore, which I think there are about half a dozen of them. Very interesting creatures and very easy to photograph. Other strange tales. This frogfish, for example, is also an egg brooder, but how it does it is that it actually carries the egg on the side of its body. As you can see in this scientific publication here, it wraps, in real life, it kind of wraps its tail around the eggs to keep the eggs protected. But obviously, the egg bundle is very distinct if you can see the animal in the first place. Because as you can see on the photos on the left, this fish looks very, very well camouflaged when it's against the backdrop of the reef. Okay, one other tale, which is an interesting one, is that at some point we heard that there was a sighting of mola mola in Singapore, or the sunfish. Very exciting, because we've only seen mola molas in exotic destinations like Bali, or maybe if you go to the US. And if we could see this here, then you'd be, wow, it's going to be great. We don't have to travel all the way just to see the mola mola. Unfortunately, during our hunt for the mola mola at Pulau Hantu, the largest fish we ever saw was this batfish, which is definitely a lot smaller than the mola mola. But you never know. It may turn up, and just like the whale shark, for example, a surprise find. So keep your eyes out for this fish. Now, NParks is making this push for a city in nature, and part of this push is working with the community. And this is what I do quite a bit with the fish work that I do. I work with researchers at NUS, NTU, JCU, the Natural History Museum, TMSI. We also work a lot with the nature groups. Friends of the Marine Park is one of the larger communities that we work with. Individual nature groups as well, like Blue Water Volunteers, Hantu Block, Marine Steward Singapore, and a lot of individuals who just volunteer their time to help us with things like fish surveys and so on. One of the research projects that we're doing is this thing called the CodeFish-SG, which is basically developing a fish DNA library. Now, based on past records, Singapore has about 800 species of fish, not just in the coral reef areas, but also in the coastal areas and in the open sea, near mangroves and seagrasses and so on. We're collecting the sequences of DNA markers such as CO1 or 12S, so that once we get this library, right, the reference can then be used to identify fishes. We can identify the larvae of the fishes or the juveniles, simply because sometimes the larvae or the juveniles don't look like the adults at all. So we need to be able to distinguish the larvae to know, if the adults will be present in the waters. The larvae and juveniles sometimes go through this thing called phase changes. Right? So what happens is that the juveniles may say be yellow in color, but as they then progress to an older stage, they may change color to some other color, maybe a more multicolored adult. We also need the library for cryptic species. Cryptic in this case is about species, species complex. wherein all the species within that complex look alike, then the variation is very minute to distinguish between the species. Having the DNA library then allows us to subsample and say that and distinguish then the different species within that complex group. Now, one other big sort of area of research that's happening these days is also environmental DNA. Having a fish library means that you potentially could just collect a sample of water, run your DNA test to see what is present in that water. Because all organisms basically share scales, mucus, waste, and so on. And potentially you can detect these trace amounts from the water using these environmental DNA techniques. More on a regulatory scale, you can also then detect invasive species. Assuming you have this library or larger reference base, you can potentially then look for invasive species that come into Singapore waters. And of course, one other use of the fish library is that you can actually trace your seafood. If you are concerned, for example, that fish that's being sold as fish X is actually the flesh of fish Y, you can use DNA then to trace or to verify that it's actually still fish X that is being sold. So this is a project that we're working with Temasek Life Sciences Laboratory, NUS, Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum, and of course NParks. I mentioned fish surveys earlier on, and we do reef surveys in general, fish just being one of the surveys that we do in many of the sites around the southern islands of Singapore, from all the way from Siren Reefs to the Sisters Islands Marine Park in the east, Pulau Hantu, Pulau Semakau in central, and all the way down south to Pulau Satu. Now, some of these sites are protected areas, so obviously we then have to work with the agencies that are protecting the sites to get access and so on. So if you do want to join in our fish surveys, please do contact us so that we can then train you up and then you can get to visit these sites as well. Just some photos of the volunteers who have provided their time to help us with some of our surveys. As you can see on the photo on the right, sometimes the waters can be very clear. In this case, this photo I think was taken quite recently, and it's got about 5 to 6 meters of visibility, which for Singapore is great. And we do encounter these kinds of visibility conditions. It's just that you need to be able to dive more often to see them. Again, back to the artificial reef. This is as I already mentioned, the artificial reef itself is a project between NParks and JTC funding most of the development and so on. Working with NUS then, we get the researchers and their students to help with looking at the artificial reef community itself. In this case, focusing on the fish. So you will see that this is a one-year study. We went out once a month, and thanks to the final year project student who took part in this program, we now know that the fish community colonizes the artificial reef really quickly. Within even like the first 2 months, and we get like hordes of fish coming in, and it's potentially a good thing because it means that we have a tool by which we can help to improve the fish stocks in Singapore waters. Other projects which I'm doing with NUS look at cryptobenthic fish. Now, these are fish that are potentially hard to see because they like to hide in holes. And this is what this, again, is kind of like an artificial structure. This is what the structure is supposed to emulate, right, on the left here. All these holes, right, basically get encrusted eventually with whatever marine organisms. And then fish such as this, Biviotas, gobies, right, will then utilize these holes to hide away from predators. Now, once the structure has been in the water for maybe about 6 months or so, then we pull out the structure and we'll see what fish have colonized the structure. more and more now, apart from just identifying fish or biodiversity per se, we're also looking at processes, and herbivory and predation are some of the key processes that we are looking for in fish. These are just a couple of photos that we've captured, that I've captured of videos, which we have placed on the reef to look at how fish feed on seaweeds. So in these videos, you will see parrotfish and rabbitfish being two of the main predators. And having videos, the video technology these days is certainly very helpful for many of these studies, because then the diver doesn't need to be in the water. Our presence in the water will scare them away because of our bubbles and so on. But placing the video there allows the fish to then be more natural in their behavior, and basically then they will go about their normal lives, which we can then observe. These are just for herbivores, which are feeding on seaweeds, but we are also going to start looking at the carnivores. Hopefully within the next couple of months, we'll start this project and then we'll know more. So you might ask, what are all these studies for? Just a very simple sort of diagram here to represent the fact that we need to know what our species are, what species we have, their behaviors and so on, so that we can establish some kind of matrix or index for the health of the habitat. There's no point in protecting an area if you can't, if it just continually degrades over time, right? So with all this information that we've gathered, we can then do outreach, education, and also devise conservation management decisions. So what is a conservation management decision, or what are conservation management decisions? Part of that is perhaps using artificial reefs to enhance fish stocks, but also then setting aside areas such as Sisters Islands Marine Park, for example, as protected areas where the fish can find refuge and be able to thrive, so that they can then have a place where they can breed, right? And if they can breed, then whatever excess individuals that come from this breeding will then spill over into the other islands or the other reefs nearby. So this is just some underwater footage from the natural reef on Sisters Islands. And as you can see, over the course of the few years that it's already been protected, the fish there they're very relaxed, they're very calm. Even with the approach of divers, they don't run away from you, right? So this kind of refugia is very important to allow healthy communities, healthy fish communities to thrive. So perhaps you're asking what you can do as an individual. There's a whole bunch of things. I think firstly, get your knowledge up. You can do that by reading off the internet. You can visit the shores. You can use the boardwalks in many of the coastal parks. You can join intertidal walks, or maybe even join the scuba dive trips to Sisters Islands or Pulau Hantu. If you like photography, you can share the photos online, and that's a lot of that going on already. You can also visit the intertidal areas, but we suggest that you go in smaller groups so that you don't trample on everything that you want to see in the first place. Right? You can volunteer with NParks or the Blue groups. There's a whole host of volunteer activities that go on: intertidal watch, beach patrol, team seagrass, and so on. One of the, I guess, behaviors that we have is, we bring our food and our water bottles and all that there. So please don't litter in the parks or in the coastline. Actually, just don't litter, right? Because that's a bad habit. However, that said, there is a lot of litter that washes up onto our shores. So you can also help out with the coastal cleanups. And if you like, say, fishing, you can practice sustainable fishing practices, such as fishing only in designated areas, or to practice catch and release. And basically, that's it. Those are just some of the stories I have for you for today. I hope you've enjoyed the time that I've had with you. And I guess, Leslie, back over to you for the Q&A.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, let's go to our Q&A. So I actually have a question for you first. Many people have expressed interest in this very colorful hat or paper crown that you're wearing. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Look at this beautiful hat. Okay, no, this hat is so one of the things NParks does also, and it's organized by the National Biodiversity Centre, is this thing called the Festival of Biodiversity. So we have a branch in NBC that's called the Biodiversity Information and Policy Group. Now they organize the Festival of Biodiversity, and as part of the collaterals, they produce things like this. So nice coral reef hats, otter hats, turtle hats, and so on. Actually, these are for kids, which kind of tells you about me. Yeah. So yeah, unfortunately, because of the social distancing that we're having right now, we can't actively give up these hats. But when things become better, then please do come down to the Festival of Biodiversity and queue up for these hats.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So you got a very colorful coral reef hat from the Festival of Biodiversity.
Yes, especially for this talk.
Okay, so now that we've got that aside, we've got a number of other questions from our audience. Starting with, do you study fish from other habitats like mangroves or seagrass meadows?
Yes, but not as much as I used to. Sadly, well, maybe not sadly, because there has been an improvement in the number of people studying fish in general. It used to be like maybe 3 people, but now we have maybe up to half a dozen or maybe a bit more people who are interested to do fish. That said, much of the focus remains around our coral reefs. That's kind of where my basic background is anyway. But we do smaller surveys in the mangrove areas and in the seagrass areas as well. We sort of lump those up as intertidal surveys, because that's kind of where they are, is usually in the intertidal zone. One of my collaborators, Dr. Zihan Jafar, for example, works quite extensively in the mangroves and the seagrass areas, looking at gobies in those areas. So while we don't have an extensive monitoring program for those areas, we do try to survey those areas as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I think you mentioned that your focus is on reef fish, but sometimes there is some overlap to the other areas as well.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe actually I should also say that just to continue this mangrove and seagrass topic, is that we know some fish actually have their larvae or go into the mangrove areas to breed, lay their eggs, and then the juveniles sort of develop in the mangrove areas, and then the adults swim back out to the reef. Similarly, for seagrass areas, typically we see a lot of juveniles there. So we figure that that's a place where they hide from the bigger predators, which are on the coral reefs. Then as they get bigger, they will then move out to the reefs. Yeah. So those are important areas as well. It's just that given the manpower that we have, the resources that we have, we can't study those areas extensively. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. So even fish that are found on the coral reefs might use other habitats like mangroves or seagrass meadows for different stages of their lifestyle. But that sounds like it could be a talk for another day. So moving on to the next question from our audience. What is your favorite fish?
Well, that's a tough one. They're all my favorites. It's like asking which is your favorite child. My favorite fish. So maybe one way to answer this question is to categorize the fish into different classes. I would think that one one of my favorites in the so-called weird fish category would be the sunfish, of which I showed the photo earlier. It's a really strange fish because it hardly has a tail, and the way it moves is just very weird. So that would be sort of one of my favorite fish. For the others, I think like the pipe fishes are also very interesting. Hardly anybody studies them because they're so small and they're very hard to find. But the ones that I've seen are all very colorful. They move around in family groups. It's just very interesting and exciting to find them. What other categories could I think of? Then you have things like the predators. I would hesitate to say sharks were one of my favorites, but they're certainly a fish that I would want to sort of photograph more safely, of course, for both the shark and myself. But I would guess in that respect would be the groupers would probably be one of my favorite photography subjects. They can be very what do you call that? They can be very brave and actually hang out and just eyeball you as you're taking photos and like, what is this guy doing with all that flashing going on? Yeah. So yeah, those are just some of my favorite fish. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned a few examples like the sunfish, the pipefish, and sharks, which I think many of us will find very intriguing. But I think as like those who have attended some of our previous talks, our speakers are really quite passionate about their subject area, and it's really hard for them to pick just one favorite. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Are the Jansen's pipefish and the dartfishes rare?
Rare. That's a bit hard to say. I would err on the side of caution and say yes, but because of their behavior, it's very difficult to quantify whether or not they are common or abundant. Now, the Jan's pipefish basically hides under crevices or under ledges, which means that on a normal swim through, you would probably miss this, even if it was like a family of 4 or 5 fish. So in terms of whether they are rare, I would say that they are less rare now than they used to be because ever since we saw the first sighting at Jom, as I mentioned, we've also seen them at Pulau Hantu, we've seen them at Raffles, we've seen them at Sisters. And not just once-off sightings either, we've seen them consistently over the course of time. So small population, very likely rare, but we don't know enough to be able to definitively say so. Dartfishes are somewhat skittish, so when in many instances when I sort of see the shadow of a dartfish in the distance, I have to very slowly approach. I have to literally crawl to approach them so that they don't get spooked. If you're just a normal diver swimming by, for example, the moment you breathe out your bubbles and they see this large shadow swimming quite fast across the reef, they will straight away duck into a hole, into a bobby hole. Also, they tend to be more on the seabed, near the seabed near the reef. So the tendency is that many divers don't actually go to those areas. They tend to stay on the reef areas. So again, it's very hard to say if they're rare, but I'll err on the side of caution and say yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, for sharing your input on that. So it's hard to be certain, especially given the behavior of these fish, because they are so hard to see and hard to identify. We can't really draw a very certain conclusion.
Yeah.
So in the world of biodiversity, there's always so much more that we are trying to understand. Moving on to the next question. Why is it important to have fish in Singapore waters, even if many have no commercial value?
Okay. That's a good question. It's an ecosystem, right? So there are many moving parts. I suppose one analogy, say if you dive, right? I could one of the questions that people ask a lot is like, oh, what's the most important piece of equipment you have when you're diving? And I'm like, have you tried diving without a mask or a fin, or or whatever piece of equipment that you need? So to say that some fish have more importance or have a commercial value is a somewhat judgmental comment or view, I think. Just because the fish doesn't have a commercial value to us does not mean that it doesn't have a value to something else. The smaller fishes could be one cog in the machinery that allows the fish of commercial value, right, to be able to be harvested or to survive within our ecosystem. How the connections are is very poorly understood, because we can't be present at every step or be able to study every single link within the ecosystem, because it's just so complex. What is important is that if you want to have the end result of a healthy reef with the kinds of fish that you would normally see, then you need to protect everything that's within it and all the ecosystem functions and so on, without this judgment of whether this fish is more important than the other. Having said that, practically speaking, yes, we do have to make some judgment on what to protect and so on, but it needs to be done with the knowledge that there is no single silver bullet. Yeah, it's the best that we can do when we talk about protection. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about the ecosystem and gave an example of like the food chain. So even fish that have no commercial value could be important to those with commercial value. So everything has to work together to make the environment livable, even for us humans. So
that's true. Yeah.
Because everything is interconnected, and sometimes you have to make a judgment, but it is important to try and not just ensure that these ecosystems thrive, but also to find a balance.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question from our audience is, where would you say is the best reef to observe fish in Singapore?
Wow. Sisters Islands Marine Park is a good place. And that's not just setting Goyo. It's actually quite the video I showed at the end of my presentation was actually videoed from very close to the dive trail at the Sisters Islands Marine Park. It's where else? Yeah, so that would probably be, in terms of the best reef, in terms of accessibility, the likelihood of seeing the fish, and the fact that you have clarity to actually observe the fish, and not scaring them away by getting too close. So I would say Sisters Islands Marine Park is one of the best places to view these fish, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so Sisters Islands Marine Park, and there actually is a dive trail there, and you can find out more information about it on the NParks website. However, do note, our diving enthusiasts, the trail is closed at the moment given the COVID-19 measures, but do pay a visit next time when it's open again. But as with wherever you go to dive, please make sure you go to a place that you have a permit to visit and stick to approved dive operators as well. Next question. What are some of the challenges in carrying out research on fish?
Wow. Okay, well, there are many challenges. The visibility of our water is one. So while I do say that we have days where the visibility is like 5 meters, 6 meters, and so on, there are also just as many days where the visibility can be quite challenging, down to like 1 or 2 meters, which makes then observing the fish quite difficult. But again, if you go out more often, then the chances of you getting or hitting the good visibility days are higher. So therefore, you can then do what we call in situ observation of the fish. Now, with the way technology is evolving, there's actually another route in which this challenge can be overcome, is actually to use video trapping. Very much like camera traps on land, basically set up videos on the reef, run them for like the 2, 3, or 4 hours that the battery can last. But then you have to go back to the lab and then you have to view the videos to see what kind of fish pass by, for example. So this is how it was done for the herbivory and predation type studies. We will set a baited trap in front of the video and then see what fish come and visit the bait. Right? If it's a seaweed as a bait, then you likely see the herbivores come in to chomp on the seaweed. If it's a squid bait or something like that, then the predators will come in, and then we'll know what predators we have. Sometimes the fish just swim by, regardless. They don't touch the bait, but they just swim by. So we've also captured things like sharks and some fish that we've not actually seen before on when we're doing our surveys. So there are challenges, but there are ways to overcome the challenges as well. One other challenge, I think I alluded to this earlier, is actually the lack of researchers to actually carry out all the research that we would like to see happen. Right now, I think actively we have maybe a dozen, sorry, not a dozen, but half a dozen, maybe a bit more researchers who are actually looking at fish. But that's obviously not enough to actually do all the work that we need to do to understand, the biology and the importance of the fish within our ecology. Yeah. So those I'd say are the two challenges. Yeah.
Okay, so to summarize, you mentioned a few challenges like the visibility in our waters because Singapore is a very busy port. Then earlier you talked about some of the shy or elusive behavior of some of the fish, which make them difficult to observe. And of course, there's always way more that we want to know, which we might not have the resources to go out and find out. But thankfully, we do have technology to help us. And I think that, in spite of the challenges, it can be quite rewarding, and there's a lot of surprises out there that we find that you've shown us. So to wrap up, what is one surprising thing about marine fish that you have found during your work in NBC?
Oh, this is another tough one. All the new surprises, I guess, and there've been quite a few. I mean, being able to photograph the duckfishes, for example, the second duckfish, the Pteroilochis microlepis that I showed today in my presentation, is a new record for Singapore, and I just took that photo like last month. So that I think is what keeps me going, is all these surprising things which I keep finding as I'm carrying out research and monitoring on our reefs. There's always something new to look forward to. And yeah, you never know when it happens. So the microlepis, for example, when I photographed it, we were doing another survey when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something dart into the goby hole. I was like, that didn't look like a goby. So after we had finished the work, I went back to the site and then I just hung out there for 10 minutes waiting for the fish to come back out. Yeah, and I managed to get a few photos. So not so much a thing, but it's a process of being surprised every time when I go up. Yeah.
Okay, so like even until today, we still discover new things. The more we look, the more we find out.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jeff. I hope that Jeff's talk has piqued everyone's interest about the rich biodiversity, not just under the sea, but also all around us on our island. Our biodiversity is precious, and here at NParks, we work hard to ensure that it's not only preserved, but also to ensure that it thrives. And we have a comprehensive plan called the Nature Conservation Master Plan to guide our approach. If you're interested to hear more about this, please watch the introduction of the first NParks Spotlight talk, Creatures of the Night, that's available on our YouTube channel. In it, our group director, Lim Liang Jim, outlines this plan, which underpins our collective effort to build our city in nature. The link will be shared with you in the Zoom chat. On our YouTube channel, you'll also find recordings of all our previous sessions for you to gain insights into the biodiversity around us. And if you enjoy these talks, do share them with your friends and family. We still have more sessions on the remaining Saturdays in August. Next week, join us for more surprises under the sea. Our director for the Coastal and Marine Branch, Dr. Karen Toon, will be sharing about her 18 years of experience documenting coral spawning in Singapore's waters. An incredible spectacle that's invisible to most, given that it occurs just once a year and under the cover of darkness. Come experience this wonder of nature through pictures and poetry. Do register to join us on Zoom or stream the talk live on the NParksSG YouTube channel. The registration link will be shared in the chat soon. And with that, it leaves me to thank Dr. Jeffrey Lowe for the session and for our audience for staying with us. Do share your feedback by scanning the QR code on my screen. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care and stay safe.
Bye.